emotional topic. And I will warn you, at times in this, there are some very confrontational issues that will be discussed that many of you, including some of the terms, will find disheartening. With that said, it's important that we have these conversations. We've already had in that introduction, that very kind introduction, mention of the Christchurch tragedy. Now, in the days and weeks that followed, what we've seen is some amazing traits of leadership. We've had some absolutely touching acts of compassion, ranging from Canberrans racing off into local mosques to meet members of the local community. We've also had a whole heap of curiosity about it on both sides. I remember my son actually asking me now, my son is 6 years old, and he's been around, due to the nature of my work, around around people from various cultural backgrounds for a number of years, so he's no stranger to difference. But interestingly, he asked me straight after that attack, he said, why do they wear that on their head? And you know, it struck me at the time as to how important explanations are in these sorts of conversations today are, but it also struck me as how easy fear can sink in. And since that attack, there has been fear. It's very easy to get caught up in that fear. Now, I started my career a very long time ago, so in the early 1990s, I found myself attending right-wing extremist meetings as part of a work requirement in Sydney and in Brisbane. These terrifying individuals, making plans, and we've seen this now go to court. They're making plans to obtain weapons for all manner of reasons. We saw the Aussie Freedom Scouts who had representation here in Canberra. Then onwards through my career, I saw it at various stages. About 16 years ago, I found myself sitting in North Carolina, in Asheville, which is actually a rather liberal township known for its artists. I was doing some research there, and I went to a nightclub with a couple of ex-soldiers where one person had called someone else a nigger lover. And it struck me at that time of how they had spat those words out. Shortly, about 30 minutes later, the person who had been called a nigger lover returned with a 9mm pistol and sprayed the nightclub, killing 2 people. About 10 years ago, I found myself in Limpopo, which is in one of the northernmost and probably one of the most troubled places in South Africa from my perspective. At the time, I was with a guide, and they were chasing what they call a pack animal, which is problem animal control. So a leopard had been eating some of the local kids, and they were tracking that down. And I said at the time, the tracker doesn't have a gun. And he said, it's okay, blacks don't carry guns. And then secondly, as we were getting ready, a number of impalas were shot and put up as baits for this leopard. I said to the guide, he goes, you wait here with a gun, I'll take the black with me. And I said, well, why don't you wait here? We sent in, can he drive? He goes, oh, no, blacks don't drive. 10 years ago, 6 years ago I should say, I found myself sitting in El Paso talking to some American officials in regards to Juarez, and talking and referring to Mexicans as wetbacks in official conversations. 4 years ago, I published an op-ed on community engagement at CVE that resulted in a white supremacist groups tracking down my home, and having worked in national security for a long time, and my wife as well, we're very difficult to find and locate. We've had a number of death threats over the years. And a group had tracked down our house and lovingly placed and sent us an envelope containing white powder and some anti-Muslim material that my then next door neighbour's child, who was about 4, picked up out of the letterbox and proudly handed over to us. In the lead up to this event, I was asked to do a couple of media interviews. And as a result of that, a series of phone calls coming through, calling me a leftist snowflake, someone who was trying to change the underlying freedom of speech in our country, right through to 2 death threats. It's an incredibly difficult space. I'm not Muslim. If I was to identify, and I said to Mohammed before this, I'm renowned as a national security hawk. My publications speak for themselves. I'm pro-national security, but I'm talking about right-wing extremism and the fear that goes along with it. For me personally, I think it's incredibly important not to be silent on this issue. Therefore today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the better part of the next 30 minutes exploring and contextualising white supremacy. We're going to do it one part. We'll do it very much with, an academic over helicopter view of it, and then we'll delve into a more conversational approach. But in the name of, I'm from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, so I'm in a halfway clearinghouse for academics. So number one is I'm not with government anymore after 25 years, so I don't represent them. So that means I'm all care and no responsibility. So I have lots of ideas, but I don't have to implement them. On the other side is I get all the benefits of being an academic without the teaching load and without being the limitations of academia. So in that sense, many of the things I'm talking about here haven't been proven with empirical evidence. They're observations and discussions, and that is me being honest with you in that conversation. But having said that, that gives us as a group plenty of space to play in, plenty of opportunities for me to get in trouble, and plenty of opportunities for us to learn something together. Now, let's start with some consideration of right-wing extremism. It's an incredibly broad topic with no single definition or ideological commitment. Now, there are many stripes of right-wing extremism in this country, including neo-Nazis, white supremacists, identitarians, racists, nationalists, patriots, anti-Semites, anti-Muslims and xenophobes. My academic piece now. Right-wing extremism is characterised by its fragmented, leaderless and multi-dimensional landscape, which is highly adaptable on one hand, yet volatile on the other. My personal experience over 30 years is the groups themselves, and I want to put this to put people at ease, they tend to cannibalise themselves. They are made up of people who don't share or have a common dogma, and as a result of that we see generations, in the moment sort of 3 decades, where they storm, form and storm again, which is in our benefit. Although groups regularly adapt and evolve their strategies and goals according to the local socio-political and economic developments, they are often subject to internal tensions, infighting due to ideological challenges and changing beliefs. The lack of coordination towards achieving unified strategic goals is a distinct feature of the extreme right landscape, which has meant that a single unit of coherent activists has not evolved. Rather, the extreme right landscape comprises of clusters of small groups with a variety of ideological views and opinions, and some more extreme than others. The nature, motivations and activities of groups across the global extreme right differ between countries as a result of local histories and politics that have shaped and influenced national identities that are unique to a specific time and place. Right-wing extremism has evolved considerably in the post-9/11 environment, and as a result, the threat pertaining to militant Islamist terrorism. The new extreme right has employed a strategy that combines conspiracy theories with socio-economic grievances caused by a decade's worth of political, security, economic and humanitarian disasters to identify a new common enemy. Muslim communities, whether citizens or newly arrived immigrants in European nations, have become a focus point of conspiracy theories, hate speech and hate crimes, perpetrated by angry right-wing activists who have successfully interwoven economic woes and the financial crash of 2008 with the international migration crisis and the persistent threat of Salafi jihadi terrorism. And this has engendered a climate of insecurity and fear rooted in perceived socio-economic injustices. Furthermore, a deepening distrust of mainstream politics and governments has created a political vacuum for extreme right-wing ideologues to step in and propose solutions to what they see as a failed liberal democratic policies such as globalism and multiculturalism encouraged by the liberal elite. Groups internationally have created a loose ideology that offers at least provisional answers on why followers feel aggrieved with modern liberal democratic society. At a global level, the extreme right has risen in prominence over the past 2 years, which is visible in the number of arrests, referrals to extremism programs, foiled plots and convictions of terrorism for extreme right-motivated violence. I want to talk a little bit about the UK as an example here. So in the UK, data from the UK Home Office demonstrates that in 2016-17, there was a distinct rise in hate crimes targeting several minority groups, including individuals from transgender, Arab and Muslim communities. Now these were especially in response to the political events like election campaigns and the EU referendum or following terrorist incidents. In 2016, a white supremacist, Thomas Muir, murdered the Labor MP Joe Cox. In December 2016, the street-based group in the UK, National Action, was prescribed a terrorist organisation and banned for its overtly violent nature. They were celebrating the murder of Joe Cox. In September 2017, 5 National Action members were arrested for preparation of terrorist attacks, and similarly 6 members were arrested in January 2018. In February 2018, the former head of counter-terrorism policing in the UK announced that 4 right-wing extremist plots had been disrupted in 2017. Elsewhere, the numbers of arrests and convictions of far-right sympathisers have also increased. The Nordic Resistance Movement Swedish affiliate members were convicted of carrying out 3 bomb attacks in November 2016 and January 2017. Members of the US-based Atomwaffen division were accused of 5 murders in 2017, and a member was convicted in January 2018 for plotting bomb attacks against synagogues and a power plant in Miami. Now the good news. Australia hasn't experienced the same type of right-wing extremism as in Europe or the US. Indeed, ASIO's 2011-2012 annual report acknowledged that the rise in far-right extremism in Europe had not been reflected in Australia. Australia's spectrum of right-wing extremists, though, is complex, broad and diverse. According to AIC, the Australian Institute of Criminology, the first right-wing extremist groups appeared in Australia during post-World War I, and they were groups such as the ex-soldiers fascist movement known as the White Army. And then since then, movements and groups have been established or developed as a response to changes in the socio-political and economic environments. Different events in Australia's political timeline have given rise to different waves of extremism and shift public support from one side of the extremist spectrum to the other. After the Second World War, the Australian League of Right was established along with other neo-Nazi groups that targeted the Jewish population and Aboriginal Australians. During the 1980s, Australia experienced a rise in extreme right violence, which coincided with a national economic recession on the one hand and the arrival of 120,000 refugees from Southeast Asia. This was the first large wave of ethnic minority immigrants since the complete dismantling of the white Australian policy. High interest rates and high levels of unemployment combined with widespread discontent over immigrants from ethnic minority backgrounds provided fertile ground for fear politics and hate speech to take root. In 1984, the Australian Nationalist movement split from National Action because they considered National Action insufficiently explicit in its anti-Semitism and neo-Nazism. Members of the newly formed group proceeded to launch a campaign of violence that included brutal assaults and firebombings. The group remains active, and 3 former A&M members torched and vandalised 4 Chinese restaurants in Perth in 2004. As a result of the escalation in far-right violence during this period, ASIO's 1989 annual report warned the only discernible domestic threat of politically motivated violence comes from the racist right. Now let's fast forward to 9/11 and its political environment. A series of global events have created a climate of fear and insecurity. Now this is allowing a new wave of far-right extremism to flourish. The advent of international Salafi jihadi terrorism, the Iraq and Afghani wars, the international financial crash, the Syrian civil war, Islamic State's self-declared caliphate, foreign fighters and lone actor terrorism, and the global migration crisis have all created a degree of fear of the unknown. Now, specifically in regards to Islam, since 2001, far-right groups have increasingly sought to demonise Islam and Muslims in their propaganda. By the late 2000s, two major changes began occurring for white supremacists and right-wing extremists. First and foremost, they began attempts to mainstream themselves. The public face of these groups moved from being the skinheads of old and the ranting old war veterans to a new polished, younger version that engaged with modern technology and eventually social media. The ideological evolution of the far right in Australia reflects this sentiment, with groups such as the United Patriots Front, True Blue Crew, Australian Settlers Rebellion opting for a clear anti-Islam stance and calling for a ban on immigration from Muslim majority countries including Africa and Arab nations. In 2015, white supremacist poster boys Neil Erickson, Blair Cottrell and another former UPF activist, Chris Shortis, were arrested for staging a beheading of a mannequin with a fake sword outside the Bendigo Council offices in protest to the proposal to build a mosque in the area. In September 2017, they were found guilty of inciting serious contempt, revolution or ridicule of Muslims under Victoria's Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, but each were fined $2,000. In April 2016, three members of the white supremacist group Aryan Nations allegedly murdered a mutual friend in a personal spat. They were convicted and charged in April 2018. Although the murder was not racially motivated, it brought the violent subculture of white supremacist groups to the attention of law enforcement and the public, noting that those charged were actively engaged in promoting racist and xenophobic content and highlighted the links between groups in Australia. And then at the end of 2016, Philip Galea became the first man to be arrested and prosecuted under terrorism legislation in Australia for far-right motivated violence. Since December 2016, at least 15 new extreme right groups have come into existence, whose focus reflect international concerns such as patriotism and nationalism, white supremacy, anti-immigration and anti-Islam. In line with the international trends, our new far-right groups in Australia are keen to shed the identity of neo-Nazi fascists and to create a new image for themselves, rooted in identity politics in a bid to mainstream their ideas and expand their influence. Right-wing extremists have successfully used widespread political malaise and economic discontent to repackage National Socialist, racist and white supremacist ideology as something more palatable. Nationalism and patriotism have been rebranded nativism, supported with anti-immigrant sentiment, while white supremacy has been rebranded as ethno-nationalism. Several extreme right groups have emerged over the past decade in Australia whose focus is distinctly on tackling the perceived threat posed by Muslims and migrants from Arab or African countries. And they routinely argue their rallies are not racist, but rather to preserve Australian culture and values. We see this sort of behaviour specifically in their products produced by characters like Blair Cottrell, who lead off their videos online with statements like, "Welcome, patriots." Now, who doesn't want to be a patriot? John Saffron's book quotes individuals at the United Patriot Front rally saying things like, this rally is not really about racists. No, look at me. Look at Blair. We are our nation. If you have a problem with that, go back to where you come from. If you are a racist, this is not the rally for you. So you should go home now. If you're an Australian patriot who cares about protecting Australia against jihadi Islamic terrorist attacks, then yes, you're in the right place. Although the UPF attempts to distance themselves from neo-Nazism and old-school right-wing fascism and racism, UPF chairman Blair Cottrell is known to admire and revere Hitler and propagate his theories, but according to his own logic, he is no Nazi. Cottrell and others advocate for white nationalism, based on a Eurocentric approach towards immigration, calling for a ban on immigration from Middle Eastern and African nations. Yet they simultaneously claim to be advocates for multiculturalism. Former UPF member Sherman Burgess explicitly denounced members of the Nationalist Alternative for participating in any UPF events, referring them to them as, and I apologise for the language, dickheads from a skinhead organisation, in order to distinguish himself between the UPF as a patriot movement and Nationalist Alternative as a neo-Nazi movement. However, Burgess's departure from the UPF was allegedly actually caused by a shift within the UPF towards neo-Nazism and white supremacy, highlighting further inconsistencies amongst the individuals and group membership. Other groups such as the Antipodean Resistance, Reclaim Australia, Aryan Nations and Expel the Parasite fall into the older style extreme right groups. Their rhetoric is explicitly neo-Nazi, opting for a clear nationalist socialist perspective, white supremacy, anti-Semitic ideology that is overtly articulated on all of their websites. Soldiers of Odin is a neo-Nazi groupuscule with links to the Patriots Defence League of Australia. It could be compared to Greece's Golden Dawn. They're a street-based movement whose politics are racist, nationalist and fascist, which explicitly target Muslims. Then there are some relatively obscure groups, such as the Identitarian Q Society movement and its political arm, the Australian Liberty Alliance, which distinctly falls into an anti-Islam, pro-Zionist camp. Their rhetoric and propaganda is dominated by preserving Judeo-Christian values, ethics and customs from the perceived threat of the Islamisation of Australia. They have a strong focus on disseminating propaganda and conspiracy theories about Islam, such as linking halal certification to terrorist financing, whilst simultaneously advocating for an integrated, multi-ethnic society. Members of Q Society are distinctly middle class and middle-aged, which is markedly different from the pub-going, social media savvy younger demographics aligning with the other groups. Although not all these groups remain functioning and their success has been limited, their proliferation at such a rapid pace is indeed concerning. And the Christchurch attacks serves to illustrate why we must be mindful of these developments. While all of this has been happening in the overt sense, more has been occurring in the hardcore elements of these groups as they've sunk into the dark corners of the internet in platforms like 4chan and 8chan. Now, the security services corroborate the shifting dynamics of the extreme right. In 2010, ASIO's annual report expressed concern about the persistence of racist, nationalist extremists in Australia. And the 2016 annual report confirmed that, and I quote for you. Extreme right-wing terrorist plots or attacks in Australia over the next 12 to 18 months would probably target the Muslim or left-wing community, be low capability and be more likely to be perpetrated by a lone actor or a small group on the periphery of an organised group. Now, bad news. In politics globally, there's been a mainstreaming of white supremacy through migrant conspiracy theories. In the process, this has increasingly legitimised blaming the alien others for the economic and security uncertainty of today. And for those that question such thinking, a consistent criticism is that you're out of touch or you're part of some leftist reform agenda. Neither is true. The trend is visible populist groups. In this trend, visible populist groups such as One Nation and their stance on issues of immigration, integration and multiculturalism stand out. One Nation leader Pauline Hanson is famously quoted in a 1996 maiden speech to Parliament saying, "I and most Australians want our immigration policy radically reviewed and that of multiculturalism abolished. I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians." By 2016, she delivered another speech to Parliament with broadly the same anti-multiculturalism message, but with a new designated enemy. Now we are in danger of being swamped by Muslims who bear a culture and ideology that is incompatible with our own. Rather than just being silly, this has given way to even more extreme political behaviour, including that by Senator Fraser Anning. What this has done is normalised hate speech in Australia. It has also like the videos from polished and appealing right-wing extremists like Blair Cottrell and their call for patriotism, which we all want, made these groups and their thinking more attractive to young Australians. The impact of global connections and social media in the lead up to the Christchurch tragedy is important. Thankfully, and I want to be very clear here, there appear to be precious few of what I would call hardcore right-wing extremists and white supremacists in Australia. What we do have though now is a global social media ecosystem and echo chamber that allows the worst of the worst to connect globally and to feed off and encourage each other in an anonymous and secure environment. We also have the fact that they've become increasingly media savvy, and we see this in the activities of Tarrant post the attack in Christchurch. Ladies and gentlemen, from my humble assessment opinion, Mr Tarrant will go through and make the largest spectacle of his prosecution throughout the court process, and we'll see that broadcast over every formal and informal social media network in the globe. He will continue to make sure that right-wing extremism and white supremacy is on the front pages of the news to the very moment he becomes convicted. If not, he would never have handed himself over to police and would never have been taken alive. Now, throughout I've said, I've sort of tried to talk about the positives and negatives of this. The greatest thing we have in our favour in terms of dealing with right-wing extremists and white supremacists in this country is that they have no shared dogma or central dogma from which to drive themselves and keep connected. So there is no indication that we are likely to see any consistent group to be able to be formed in the short, medium or long term that will be able to create a critical mass in which to either become mainstream or alternatively to undertake attacks. This being said, I do think that in the age of social media, smaller groups have a larger access to uncommitted followers. So what we're seeing, whilst we're not going to necessarily see the groups form that attack us, left undealt with, the nature of social media means that these groups will apply a appealing front face, which they've done over the last several years, and eventually they'll find some, and Blair Cottrell came very, very close to being that front face, you know, the clean-cut right-wing extremist who is, you know, has a wonderful, appealing leadership style of drawing people in. We stopped short with that. His conviction stopped and prevented him, and the reactions from social media giants such as Facebook, Twitter and YouTube, who are consistently removing his material before it can be viewed, in our favour at the moment. However, we must be mindful of the attraction and the language that is used. In our favour also, and this is a question that quite often gets asked, is following the terrible tragedy of the Port Arthur massacre, John Howard put in a series of gun controls in this country which mean that getting access, and I'll give you a very good quote on this, getting access to the sorts of weapons that we use in Christchurch are nearly impossible in this country. I'll give you a quote that's come from several of Australia's, over the last decade, I've heard several of Australia's leading law enforcement officials say, which is, even the good crooks have bad guns in Australia, John. The types of weapons that we used in the Christchurch attack are difficult to obtain. We have an extremely strong and robust intelligence and law enforcement capability that has been maintained its focus on right-wing extremists in the 3 decades that I've been involved in government. To be fair, and there is always going to be criticism, the amount of resources attributed to that ebbs and flows based on priorities, and that can be true. But certainly the image painted that right-wing extremism, and if you listen to the series of quotes that I gave in regards to ASIA's annual report, right-wing extremism has been front and centre, and white supremacy has been front and centre of our law enforcement agencies. But unfortunately, like I said, hate speech is here to stay for the time being. What I want to do now, and the typical thing is very easy, in terms of consultancy, there's always a famous saying, you know, it's very easy to admire a problem. And it's very easy for me to stand up for 30 minutes and tell you all the miserable things, which after 25 years in the intelligence professional and national security is my bread and butter. I'll tell you all the things that are bad. So what I want to do is finish up by making some very clear statements about things that we can do to address this. Number one, in this country we need to monitor hate speech. We've been left behind by the US, and by this I don't mean we need to find a good definition for it, but we need a national register for hate speech and hate crime in this country so that we can maintain a litmus test of where this problem is at. That needs to be nationally administered. Where the states and territories fit into that needs to be discussed, but we need a national register to track the volume and veracity of this type of material. Secondly, we need to talk about things. Okay? Central to all of these issues is uncertainty and fear. The 21st century, and I say in terms of my national security work, I'm a child of the 80s, so the world was under threat of an existential threat. Existence as a result of thermonuclear war was threatened. And we're very fortunate in today's day and age, and I'm not saying that the thermonuclear war is impossible with a rising, ascending China and a returning Russia, but what I'm saying is the likelihood of war is probably up there higher, but the likelihood of thermonuclear war, an existential threat to humankind, is pretty low. Okay, so having said that, fast forward, we live in a complex environment where there's more uncertainty than ever. And so as a result of that, it's very easy to prey on the fear and uncertainty in the community and to be able to identify a strange alien other from which to place blame. And I said to the earlier example, my son asked me, and I've had the great fortune of working over the last couple of years with the government of the United Arab Emirates and the individual Emirates being, certainly UAE, Sharjah and, Abu Dhabi, Sharjah and Dubai. And as a result of that, I have a good ear for Asian language, terrible ear for Arabic, unfortunately. But what I did do is I taught my son to say, Assalamu alaikum. I did it for a couple of different reasons. I think it's a very beautiful phrase. It's a very beautiful turn of phrase. It's very important, and he understands what it means. It's very important greetings, and I found 25 odd years or longer now working in international environments, a simple greeting goes a long, long way. At Skyfire, the night, well, 2 nights after one night after the terrible attack on Christchurch, my son turns around and says to a young woman who had a daughter with her, turns around and says, Assalamu alaikum, and he was being silly and friendly, as 6-year-olds want to do. And she stopped, burst into tears, gave him a big hug, and asked him, and had a similar thing, about 6 months ago, where, and I was saying to some of the people, well, my husband and others beforehand, we live in Franklin, and we're walking along, and he sees a woman in a hijab, and he just says, Assalamu alaikum. She's walking to their older son, who's about 20, and turns around, they're like, oh, really excited, and they turn around, and the son goes, oh, where are you from? He goes, I'm from Australia, mate. I think this is really important. So, in terms of all this, what we need to do with white supremacy, I can sit and take those sorts of stories. I think what we really need to do is continue the conversation on these issues. And what we need to do is break down the strange other. So it's quite simple. There's nothing to be afraid about with people wearing a hijab. So the next point that I make in a very sensible policy way is we need to speak up about this. And about bad behaviour and the hate speech that is increasingly walking into our culture and our politics in Australia. And I could sit there and give you some cliche statement around, the behaviour you walk by is the behaviour you accept, but the fact of the matter is that is the case. And I've been just as guilty of it in my time. I was talking to someone beforehand, they were telling me, relaying a story about how someone had made an inappropriate comment in regards to Muslim, and the thing was, Australians were all joking and that sort of stuff. Well, we moved on from this. So we've moved on from this. For those old enough in the room, in the 70s and 80s in this town, probably earlier, there was a great deal of conflict in the Australian public service and finger pointing around Catholics and Protestants and who was part of what mafia and things like that. Now, we moved on from that. We know that that's deeply offensive. So now we need to move on from this, and we need to make sure that we make clear statements of what is acceptable and not. I think there's a very important counter-narrative to the worst of the worst. And these are the people who are sitting, these are people at the Tarrants of the world. These are people sitting in dark places in the web like 8chan, sharing and egging each other on to undertake attacks. Now, of course, there's people out there, since doing an interview with the Canberra Times over the weekend, who rightly pointed out that I'm some sort of snowflake and destroying liberal order and freedom of speech. But the fact of the matter is this, is those people are operating on 8chan. 8chan is a social media site where people who exploit children go to exchange child exploitation material. This is a location that people go to exchange and undertake criminal activity, and the worst types of criminal activities. The counter-narrative is really simple, which is at some level these people have an understanding that the language that they're speaking is so vile that it cannot occur in any other part of the internet. That they've got to hang around and be involved with people who exploit children. And ladies and gentlemen, that is a powerful counter-narrative for the messages that they're putting out in the world. Because at some level they themselves understand that that's the case. So whilst I continue to maintain my I'm all care and no responsibility, I did give some actual things that we can actually do about this that start in this room. These conversations start in the house. They start with children, they start with grandchildren, the neighbours' kids, and they go all through the workplace. We have to address the level of fear and uncertainty in this town and everywhere else. And it starts with individuals and it starts with the behaviour that we're willing to accept by our politicians. With that said, I do want to say thank you to Bluestar for the invitation for speaking today. And I know that I've flipped between very academic perspectives and a very personal perspective, and that's very deliberately because I've spent about 30 years with these sorts of people at various stages, and I feel that I would do an injustice not to speak about my personal experiences with them. Thank you very much, Mohammed.
Take some questions?
If you want me to, I'm happy to. I'm an old soldier, by the way, so I'm deaf, so if I'm moving closer like that, please forgive me.
Question about language. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and is a fascist, why are they insisting in calling it populism? Well, what you need to do is look at Hungary, Poland, there are a few others in play. Across the globe, it is historically, it's fascism.
I think fascism is really loaded. So I work in.
That's the whole point. That the word fascism.
Yeah, but I think it's overused by advocates and others. And the reason I give this is that so unfortunately for my sins, my programs at ASPI cross all of the most controversial parts of current Australian politics. So I look after offshore processing, migration, border security, drugs, child exploitation, a whole range of those sorts of things. Now, what I have is I have an endless supply of advocates who are calling the Australian government fascists for what they do on Manus Island. Now, simply, you might think that they're fascists, but if you look at the true definition of fascism, that's not fascism. Okay, so that's from my perspective. But what I'm saying though is I think the term has become so watered down, fascism, that it does the little value in turning. All you end up doing is you end up being written off. So I would never use fascism in a formal presentation about a right-wing extremist group, because I think it just gets written off as just another left-wing person. And as I said, I'm a national security corporate, not left-wing. And I think that's the difficulty of that language, because I don't think fascism as a term does justice to the vile nature of these groups.
But by using, if you unpack the word and consider the baggage and the horror that the baggage contains, that strikes a better chord. Certain publications, Guardian still use the term.
And that's my point exactly. I think that anyone would say, and I'm not, what I'm saying is I'm saying for a policy person in this town, the minute you start quoting the Guardian, if I start saying that to senior members of government, I know what their responses are going to do. So that's the answer to that. You answered your own question, that's why.
Maybe, I mean, like if you look at Manus, I mean, like where did the first concentration camps come from? England and South Africa, weren't they?
Yes, I've just got two brief questions. So just last week, the G20 Religious Leaders Summit has taken place. One of the great questions that came out of that meeting is how can governments work more closely with religious organisations beyond, the security aspect, like interreligious violence or persecution? And the second one is to free speech. So how do we balance on social media anti-discrimination laws with people wanting to speak the truth according to the dictates of their religion, for instance? So without, because my concern is, could that be broadened to a point where it's chilling free speech, but also you have to balance getting rid of hate speech? So.
The first question is probably easier, the second one's scary. I think that great cooperation. I said 4 years ago I wrote a piece on CBE and engagement with the Islamic community, and I found myself receiving probably some of the worst push from people in the community and hate mail. And I found myself redoing in last year writing the CT strategy for the New South Wales government. The challenge is when it comes to religious groups that we look at it from a national security lens from the very start. It's like, how do we get Fataman to, when it's started as being radicalised, to dob him into the national security hotline? That's a wrong question from the start. So I think that, and if you ask, you ask the Islamic communities of Australia, so if we go to Sydney or Melbourne, I've done this, and you ask their leaders, every 2 weeks, a constant flow of government officials from various agencies come rocking in through the door to talk to them about radicalisation and language, and I think that we started with the wrong lens. Or alternatively, the other one which I find is, half a dozen AFP police officers or and I went to a conference, an academic conference recently, and said this to the head of New South Wales CDE, who I thought her brain was going to blow off her shoulders. Which is, half a dozen cops going out playing AFL with a group of Muslim kids who are already not the kids who are being radicalised, is not CBE and is not community engagement. So I think we're about 5 steps in the wrong direction. I think that the engagement has to look very different to what it looks like today, and I think it has to be genuinely about social cohesion. And when I say that, the closet righties in the room like myself, and I'm using very binary language, but I'm a security hawk, remember, so I'm saying that I think social cohesion is important. I think it's achievable. We've just got to change the mechanism of how we engage with groups. On the other one, the freedom of speech, well, this is there's a famous ruling in regards to pornography in the US. A Supreme Court judge, he goes, I can't define what pornography is, but I know when I see it. And I'm not being glib, but for those who sit there, I'm sure there'll be a few lawyers in the room who'll chip me afterwards for that quote, but I'm not being glib, but I think that we all know, I think we know when we're seeing racism, especially online, what's acceptable and what's not.
I guess just from that point, the risk is concerns in the future could definitions be broadened, particularly when there's been contentious issues surrounding...
Absolutely. It's a real risk. It's an alive issue. I always find interesting in this town, policy is an interesting space. So I spent 25 years way on this side and the side where I could just poke and surround problems and just sort of sit there and admire them for other people. Policy is an interesting thing. It's a living, breathing activity, and one which we must be mindful all the time. And to use your example, Auschwitz didn't just become Auschwitz overnight. There was a long transition of how the Germans got to that point. And everyone closed a blind eye to it along that way. In that way, and it's a terrible example in terms of, it's very emotional, but I would suggest to you that in dealing with these issues, we need to be alive to the issues of changes to our politics and laws. And I'm not saying that you can't upset people, and I said in my other work, if I turn around and say, well, until such time, and I did this recently, so I did an interview in regards to someone who is in onshore detention. An international ruling had come back, and I turned around and I said to a media representative, bottom line is that it's whether they're in arbitrary detention or not. And the issue at order was this: the person had been had allegedly set fire to a detention centre and had verbally abused a female member of staff there. And in both cases, if we go back to the letter of the law and character test, it turns around and says, well, there are reasons for not accepting someone and allowing them out of detention and not granting them a visa based on character tests. Anyway, they said that was the case. She's like, you're being a fascist. You know, and it's like, you can't say that, you can't. So I think, you know, we have to be very mindful. Like, just because we can fight racism, and we can fight white supremacy, but we don't have to give up freedom of speech, nor does it mean that we're not going to hear things that we don't like. But certainly, you know, I use this, so one of my master's degrees is a criminology. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no evidence to suggest that any particular colour, race, creed, gender is more prone to crime than anyone else. So there's no causal links to that. So at the very start, you know, there's no causal link to say that because I'm white I'm less likely to commit crime. So, you know, any language that suggests that is wrong too. So my point is that I think that we need to bet all the conversations in facts, and that there's no simple solution to it either.
Yes. I actually also have a question about language, specifically the use of the word terrorism or terrorist. Do you notice if in Australia there is a difference in the use of the word in mass media, by legislators, or even in legislation, whether we're dealing with a, let's say, far-right perpetrator or a Muslim perpetrator?
The legislation.
As opposed to the word, as opposed to the use of the word violence or attack.
Look, I think that that's a tough question, and I think in practice we see a tendency to use the word terrorism earlier if there are indications that it's Islamic inspired. I think that would be fair to say that there's a tendency to use it earlier, where, you know, if it was left-wing or right-wing supremacists or white supremacists, there'd be a tendency it'd be a slower use before we got to that term. And, you know, and sometimes, you know, I found myself at this with this. So, is Tarrant a spree killer in that he committed murders, he committed 51 murders and killed 51 people, or is he a terrorist? So I struggle with that. You know, if you apply that, you can sort of sit there and go, and when does, you know, like everyone calls the Link Cafe, which for me personally as an analyst, an act of terrorism. That was the act of someone who's mentally unwell, and so, you know, the labelling of terrorism has really becomes quite difficult. So in answer to it, I think that in practice, yes.
I would make, and to answer, I mean, to address sort of your question, I would say, I would make the distinction between, or the link between the Christchurch attack and the suicide bomb.
But he didn't intend on suicide bombing. He didn't intend on dying
to kill large numbers of
people. He did, but he didn't. The difference is he didn't, and this is where language is really important. He was most definitely not looking at dying there that day, I don't think.
What I mean is that in both cases, the aim was to kill large numbers of people.
Oh, it was, that's right. But this is where I'm saying definitions, because the aim for the guy in the Northern Territory last week was, despite the fact he was drug-addled and had a mental health issue, was to kill multiple people as well. So, but he's not a terrorist. Now, would he be a terrorist if he had a misunderstanding of Islamic religion? Would he been, probably would have been, if he was Middle Eastern, I'd bet you any money he would have been. If he was a white supremacist, it would have taken a couple of weeks before the definition came out going, well, he was guided. I think that, in answer to your question, I think we're slower. Well, the legislation is ambivalent. I think we're slower to identify right-wing extremism as terrorism. And I think even if you look at a lot of the cases I've outlined today, I think many of those wouldn't be defined as white supremacy or right-wing extremism. They'd be defined as criminality. And that's also interesting for it. But having said that, I'll say this, which is ASIO treated terrorism as terrorism, AFP treated terrorism as terrorism.
Last one, Viv.
I just wanted to ask, what proportion, percentage of the population would you put white extremists at, and how does that compare in Australia with international?
Look, to do so would be a bare guess. You know, I don't have a I think. Look, proportionally, I think we're very, very low with the. We would be globally low with the, and if we go by criminal statistics, and you know, I torment a couple of interns, you know, every year, make them go back through the lead statistics for me. It depends on how, you know, and I'll talk about hate crime as an example of this, but I think very small comparatively. But how the dangerous factor, ladies and gentlemen, is this: is that very small number of people now have places like 8chan, where the small number of people in all the different places can get together and feed off each other in a secure and malevolent way. So, you know, you only need one tyrant. I think, and in terms of communities, I'd say that Islamic communities in Australia, you know, I think they're safe. You know, I think that you've got to be security aware like anyone does. The definitional problem I said to you is the other part, which is there was a swastika drawn on a mural in Bondi a little while ago. And the question really is, and they want people up in arms, and as they should be. And the question is, when was that an act of hate, or when was an act of an idiot 14-year-old boy who just spray painted something on a wall, and how do we define that? It's one of the things that, you know, I really think, and to answer also your question, it's one of the reasons, and I know I've had a lot of conversations with Nick Callis for this, who's the previous New South Wales Police Deputy Commissioner, and he is with me on this. We need a hate crime register at the very least, but we need to also be looking at hate speech in this country and having a litmus test that we can apply at least some empirical evidence so that we can measure this, and it's not all in like, you know, in qual work. I'm a qual guy, so you know I like it, but I think it's just we need to quantify this in this language.
Ladies and gentlemen. Oh, is it a short one? We're really out of time. We've passed. Yep.
Very quickly, I noticed, I know about the Martin Bryant case, that he had emotional and intellectual limitations. Young Soulis, who we just heard about, the man who did the massacre in Christchurch, all of them were bullied at school.
Lots of people are bullied as children. You know, the road to radicalisation, and I've, you know, being in a think tank, because you all care and no responsibility, you get to spend a lot of time with people listening and talking, a lot of experts. And, the road to extremism and radicalisation in all its forms is different for different people. It is so diverse. So for every one of those that you find who's a bullied young child, you'll find others who, you know, come from great middle class backgrounds, there's wonderful parents who, and then you find the ones who abuse and that sort of stuff. The fact of the matter is, in looking at these, we need to create, we need to be somehow, in some way, in each of those cases, society, you know, if you look at, if the aim is to reduce hurt, society somehow failed in managing those individuals and seeing them. So in Tarrant's case, you know, he was a boy who, he's a classic example. So he's a boy whose father died young, totally confused, enters the world somewhere in his global challenges and global travels, and I suspect most likely in the UK, he met up with some right-wing extremists that were just at the right time to sell him that he was going to be part of something. And then he was able to engage in 4chan and 8chan online and get further, he had a greater sense of belonging, and before he knew it, he's way over here on the right. But somewhere along the line in all of that, society failed him. You know? And I'm not saying he is responsible, ladies and gentlemen, for this, so you know, I hope he rots in hell. I hope he rots in jail for the rest of his life and then some. Because it's pretty clear that he committed that offence. But having said that, though, somewhere along the line, someone must have seen those indicators. Guys in the gun clubs in New Zealand, they're practising outside of Christchurch. They're like, oh, he was a weirdo, you know, we didn't like him. There's a point of failure. And I'm not blaming just them, there were probably a whole series of them. Yeah, and it's too late to turn around and say, I just find it quite, like, I would never, if your child is addicted to heroin or ice or something, we don't turn around and say, you know, go to the cops and dob them in.
And the practical evidence is in the 1980s. The Australian Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, then stands up and says, you know, my daughter is a heroin addict. He doesn't ring up the police. So why in the hell would we bring up if our child is getting off the tracks? What makes us expect that, you know, whether they're right-wing extremists or whether they're Islamic extremists, we expect that a mother and father is going to turn around and go, oh, my son is off the rails, I need to go take him to the police. So I think a series of things along the way failed these people. And that whilst I don't want to diminish their responsibility for their acts, we need to build this cycle. And this isn't some, you know, I'm not kumbaya-seeing left-wing hippie or anything else. I am a national security hawk and a conservative, and I want to see these kids get a better life and we don't have violence in the community. And that's the way you do it, is by spending them. So in answer, yes, we need to do bulleting. I think that's a no-brainer, but that's not the only thing. I think there are a series of things that fail these people. And a series of indicators that we don't seem to pick up on. I know that's probably a long-winded way to answer that question. That's a tough question. I know.
Guys, we're running out of time. Could you put your hands together for Dr.